You change the world you live in phenomenologically, psychologically, by changing what you aim at. And the reason for that is that you can't see much of the world. There just isn't enough of you. You have to ignore most of the world. I mean, obviously, you're not paying attention to what's going on in the country next to you in any real sense. So, for example, I mean, the fact that you're localized right here and right now means there's all sorts of things that you just physically can't attend to. But even in the space you're in, you're basically blind to everything that isn't serving the purpose that you're aiming at. So that's worth thinking about. If you're blind to everything that isn't serving the purpose that you're aiming at, and you can't see anything good, then one potential conclusion is that you're not aiming at the right thing, because there's lots of things in the world that could manifest themselves to you. And I really mean this physically. It's a physical thing as well as a psychological thing. And so if all you see in the world is frustration, misery, cruelty, tragedy, and malevolence, and that's crushing you, then you can ask yourself, well, are you so certain that you're aiming at the right thing? Now, I'm not saying that all people suffering is a consequence of the inappropriateness of their aims. I think that's a big mistake, because there's an element of life that's sort of ineradicably arbitrary. Then that's...
You mean the randomness of the universe, basically?
Yeah, well, the fact that bad things happen to good people, it's basically as simple as that. Or terrible things happen to good people even. Or even that terrible things happen to bad people. There's a randomness element to it. And you don't want to get too high on your horse about that and assume that, if something bad happened to you, it's because it's your fault. Sometimes it's your fault. And sometimes there's something you could do to decrease the probability that that will happen again. But sometimes you're just, you got hit by a bus and the bus jumped the curb, and that's just how it is. But having said that, you don't want to underestimate the degree to which you can change the way the world manifests itself to you by changing what you're aiming at. So then the question, of course, becomes, well, what should you aim at? And the first answer to that is, I should aim at something, right? Something, that's the first rule. Aiming at something is better than not aiming at something. So I wrote a fair bit about that in 12 Rules for Life too. There's a rule in there that says, compare yourself to who you were yesterday instead of who someone else is today. That's something that you can aim at. Even if you don't know what's up, you might be able to think, or what direction up is, you might be able to think, well, I'm reasonably aware of some of my flaws, and not flaws necessarily by other people's reckoning, although that too, but flaws by your own, that you've identified by your own internal sense of orientation, things about yourself that you're dissatisfied with that you could change. It's like, well, you could start changing those, like in small ways. That turns out to be way more powerful than people think. Not only do you start to outline what your aims might be, but you also start to treat yourself like you're the sort of person who can have aims. And that's a real revelation for many people, because they believe consciously or implicitly that life is something that happens to you. And fair enough, there's an element of life that happens to you, but it doesn't life doesn't happen to you any more than when you're captaining a ship, the ocean takes you where it wants to go, right? Sometimes the ocean takes you where it wants to go, and sometimes that's to the bottom of the ocean. But if you have a seaworthy ship and you're a decent captain, then you can make your way across the ocean, even if there's a storm. And that's a good metaphor, that sailing metaphor. It's also why I think people love sailing so much, because it has that metaphorical or metaphysical reality to it, as well as being something practical.
Plus the promise of bounty behind the horizon, probably, if you start moving towards a particular goal.
Yeah, well, that's it. And it's also, it's a bounty that can increase as you progress towards it as well. It's like, well, I'd like things to be slightly better than they are today.
Yeah.
Okay, well, then tomorrow will be a little better. And then what you're aiming at is a little, grander, nobler, grander, both of those things.
You've improved your position. And that feels good in itself, and that gives you a sense of control, I think.
And a sense of hope. Because if you've done it once, even a bit, you think, oh, well, I did it once. I can probably do that much again, and maybe I could even do more. And maybe if I practiced hard for like 10 years, I might get really good at this. And the thing is, people do get really good at it. They get amazingly good at it. And then you meet people now and then who, like, They're very astute captains of very powerful and fast ships. You think, well, how do you get there? It's, well...
Incrementally, probably.
Yes, incrementally.
Yeah. You start with a raft and
Yeah.
you start building towards that speedboat. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And it helps to be healthy, and it helps to not have tragedy befall you, and all of those things. You need good fortune. You need to avoid the hurricanes to keep the metaphor going.
Although sometimes I wonder if that... Exactly. Sometimes you need the hurricanes to become a better captain, because a lot of the people that I've met that are really highly focused and goal-oriented also have some past trauma in their lives. That something happened to them that showed them that, well, life can be a bitch. And sometimes it's rough. And that sort of hardened them to do the things that they need to do in order to get to their goals.
Yeah, well, that's
a little bit better.
Yeah, that's an initiation process. Well, it is really useful to know the difference between something terrible and something unfortunate. You know, and you need to have had a terrible experience before you can really distinguish between those two. And then you have to learn that, well, it helps you learn what you should be worried about and what you shouldn't be worried about, but it also helps you know that you're tougher than you think you are.
Well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. And so, and that's why there's, you know, an idiosyncratic element of it for everyone. Your particular place of enlightenment and terror is not going to be the same as yours, except that they're both places of enlightenment and terror. So they're equivalent at one level of analysis and different at another. So anyways, back to fiction and what it does. It distills truth, and it produces characters that are composites. And the more they become composites, the more they approximate a mythological character. And so they become more and more universally true and more approximating religious deities. But the problem with that is they become more and more distant from individual experience. And so with literature, there's this very tight line where you need to make the character more than merely human, but not so much of a god that, you know, one of the things that happened to Superman in the 1980s, Superman started out, he's got a heavenly set of parents, by the way, and an earthly set of parents, and he's an orphan like Harry Potter. Very common theme is that when Superman first emerged, he could only jump over buildings, you know, and maybe he could stop a locomotive, but by the time the 1980s rolled around, like, he could juggle planets and, you know, swallow hydrogen bombs, and, you know, he could do anything. Well, people stopped buying the Superman comics because how interesting is that? It's like something horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And something else horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And it's like, that's dull. He turned into such an archetype. He was basically the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God, and that's no fun. It's like God wins, and then God wins again, and then again God wins, and, you know, so then they had to weaken him in different ways with kryptonite, you know. So green kryptonite kind of made him sick, and red kryptonite, I think, kind of mutated him, if I remember correctly. And anyways, they had to introduce flaws into his character so that there could be some damn plot, and that's something to think about, you know. There's a deep existential lesson in that your being is limited and flawed and fragile. You're like the genie, which is genius in the little tiny lamp, you know, this immense potential, but constrained in this tiny little living space, as Robin Williams said when he played the genie in Aladdin. But the fact that you have limitations means that the plot of your life is the overcoming of those limitations, and that if you didn't have limitations, well, there wouldn't be a plot, and maybe there would be no life. And so that's part of the reason why perhaps you have to accept the fact that you're flawed and insufficient, and live with it and consider it a precondition for being. It's at least a reasonable idea. Your country is your greatest friend and your worst enemy, you know, because it squashes you into conformity and demands that you act in a certain manner, and reduces your individuality to that element that's tolerated by everyone else, and it constrains your potential in a single direction. And So it's really tyrannical, but at the same time, it provides you with a place to be and all of the benefits that have accrued as a result of the actions of your ancestors and all the other people that you're associated with. So there's the good tyrant or the bad tyrant and the good king, and those are archetypal figures, and that's because they're always true, and they're always true simultaneously. You know, which is partly why I object to the notion of the patriarchy, because it's a it's the what do you call that? It's the apprehension of a mythological trope, which is that of the evil tyrant, without any appreciation for the fact that the archetype actually has two parts, and the other part is the wise king. And you know, you can tell an evil tyrant story about culture, no problem, but it's one-sided, and that's very dangerous, because you don't want to forget all the good things that you have while you're criticizing all the ways that things are in error. That's a lack of gratitude, and it's a lack of wisdom, and it's founded in resentment, and it's very dangerous, both personally and socially. I told you that Captain Hook is a tyrant because he's got this crocodile chasing him, and the crocodile has a clock in its stomach, and that's death. It's like, obviously, right? Tick, 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 tick. And it's a crocodile, and it's under the water, and it's already got a taste of him, so he's being chased around by death, and that makes him terrified and resentful and cruel and bitter, and so he's a tyrant. And he wants to wreak havoc everywhere. And then Peter Pan, of course, looks at Captain Hook and thinks, why the hell should I grow up and to be a tyrant and sacrifice all the potential of childhood? And the answer to that is, the potential sacrifices itself if you don't utilize it as you mature, and you just end up a 40-year-old lost boy, which is a horrifying thing to behold. It's almost as if you're the corpse of a child, the living corpse of a child, because who the hell wants a 6-year-old, 40-year-old? You're a little on the stale side by that point, and not the world's happiest individual. So, you know, your potential is going to disappear because you age anyways, and so you might as well shape that potential in a particular direction and at least become something, no matter how limited, rather than nothing.